Today, we're going to have an introduction to the Gilded Age that is also going to talk about immigration from that time period. And our period 6 for APUSH is 1865, so just the end of the Civil War, all the way through 1898. To understand the period, it is a transformation of the United States from an agricultural to an increasingly industrialized and urbanized society. And we're going to talk about how it becomes more industrialized and urbanized. And we're going to talk about the significant economic, political, social, environmental, and cultural changes that happen as a result of this. So, this is a period of great transformation in the United States. To understand why it's called the Gilded Age, we have to first look at what the term gilded means. And it is something that is covered thinly with gold paint, such as you can see this image here, where this once was covered completely with gold paint, likely, but is beginning to wear off. And you can see underneath that it's just a regular figurine. And when you think about the ancient, not the ancient, but the older palaces of Europe, and you think of some place like Versailles, or I had the opportunity to visit Catherine the Great's palace in St. Petersburg, Russia, and it is just covered with gold paint everywhere and made to look so wealthy and so opulent. And we know that it's just covered with gold as opposed to actually physically made of gold, but it makes it look like it's so expensive. And the term Gilded Age actually comes from Mark Twain. He did it as a form of satire. And he said that if you look at the Gilded Age, you see this enormous wealth that is made. We have the first millionaires in this country during this time period. There is rapid industrialization and expansion that's happening. But if you peel away that, you look underneath the surface, you peel away that so called gold paint, and you're going to find that there's a lot of serious political, social, and economic problems that are happening in the country during this time. And so that's why it's called the Gilded Age. Here is the estate of the Vanderbilts, and we will learn more about Cornelius Vanderbilt during this unit. And this is in Rhode Island, I believe, is where this location is. And one of the things that they said about the Gilded Age is that they had so much money that they would throw these massive parties, and they would have no problem rolling $100 bills and turning them into cigarettes that they would burn. And so that just shows you they had all this money that just to throw away. That can't imagine people today doing something like that and just burning $100 bill for fun. But that's what they did during the time. So to understand the historical context is really important to this. What is it that sets the scene for this massive thing that's going on and what's happening at the time? So if we go back prior to the beginning of this time period, we're talking about Reconstruction, or during this time period, we're talking about Reconstruction, and as well as the Republican government. And during the Civil War, they passed a number of different acts that are going to help lead to this, such as the Pacific Railway Act that we talked about, the Homestead Act, and different things. The fact that there had been no opposition in Congress allowed them to get a lot of things done that set the stage for this. And that's what it's referring to here by the Republican government during the Reconstruction period. This is the time period of the Second Industrial Revolution. You remember that I told you initially back in period 4 that the acronym TRIC ROSE could help you distinguish between the two different time periods. And the first one, the Market Revolution, was textiles, railroads, iron, and coal. And that was what TRIC stood for. And now we have the second part. The Second Industrial Revolution is ROSE. Railroads, again, during this time period, oil, steel, and electricity. This is a massive time of urbanization and growth of cities. More people are moving to the cities than ever before. And during the video on the social issues of the time, you're going to learn a lot more about that. This is also the era of forgotten presidents. And it's called that because most people that you ask, an average person, can't really name any of the presidents of the Gilded Age because they were weak and ineffective. And really, it's the business magnates, the giants of the business world that are really the ones with the power, and Congress and the presidents even just kind of do their bidding. But we will do a video about politics during the Gilded Age where we'll talk more about who these individuals were. In addition, we have westward expansion. I previously mentioned that during the Reconstruction period and even during the Civil War, the fact that we only have one political party really in government is going to allow them to pass things like the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, and things like that that are going to fuel westward expansion. And really, to me, the most important thing to know about the Gilded Age is it would not have been possible had we not had a massive flood of immigration from Europe, as well as some from Asia coming that is going to provide a steady supply of labor. We would not have a second industrial revolution had there not been workers to fuel the factories and to make the products. We would not have had urbanization and the growth of cities had there not been this massive amount of humanity that comes to places like New York City that needs a place to live. And so, really, to me, the most important thing for you to remember as far as historical context for whatever story you're telling of this time period really is that massive amount of humanity, the massive immigration, which we will get to later in this video. Actually, we'll get to right now. The three waves of immigrants. The first wave is the colonial era in the 1600s and 1700s. So these are our founding fathers, the founding individuals that came that were primarily from England. We have some from Scotland, some from a few other places, but such as the Dutch. But it's really that colonial era of individuals coming. The second wave is going to happen in the time period 1840, 1850, prior to the Civil War. And these are primarily going to be Irish and German immigrants. We've talked a little bit about them before, but I'm going to go into more detail here, even though it's outside the time period, because it helps you to understand. And this third wave of immigration that starts about 1870 and goes through 1920, they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as from China. They're unskilled, they don't speak English, and they're poor. So they are different. They're coming from places like Italy and Russia and Greece and Poland. Southern and Eastern Europeans were primarily the ones who had come before were coming from Northern and Western places that were much more like the American culture. They were primarily speaking English or a language like that, and they had some money when they came prior to this. Whereas these individuals, when they step off the ships that bring them to our shores, they probably spent their last penny. And as a result, they're going to settle in those cities that I just previously mentioned. They're coming for different reasons as well, such as we'll get into on the next slide. We also have some Asian immigrants who are coming from China and from Japan. And the key thing to look at this immigration wave is that they are different. They don't speak English. They are primarily unskilled. They don't come with any particular job ability that previous individuals had. And so that's part of why they're going to fuel the factories, and they're poor. They're going to settle primarily on the coasts in those cities because they just can't afford to go inland anywhere else. And they're not going to go to the south, really. It's going to be primarily in the north, and some will make it to the Midwest to places like Chicago. Why did they come to the United States? When you look at these lists, I want you to understand that whether it was that first immigrant that came, like the Pilgrims, or those immigrants that came to Jamestown in 1607, or the immigrant who comes in 2020, these are all the same reasons that still exist to this very day. We have things that are called push factors, reasons that force people to leave their own country. They're pushing them out of wherever they lived, such as famine and not having enough food to eat. That's a very motivating factor. Religious persecution. Not everywhere in the world do they have the ability to worship as they please. There may be a dictator or a tyrannical form of government that pushes them out. Overcrowding. That's one of the reasons so many people came from England, as we know, was the fact that there just weren't enough jobs for people, and poverty. Pull factors are reasons that make them want to come to the US in particular. An immigrant from Italy, for example, could go anywhere else in the world. So why is it that they come to the United States? Well, this idea of freedom here in the United States to be able to make their own choices, freedoms of religion, freedoms of speech, things like that. The idea that they could have a better life, especially for their children. A lot of them come with that motivating factor of, I want my kids to have a better life than I did. And going into that includes education, as well as more job opportunities, and really the idea of American dream. And to me, the American dream is the idea that you can someday own your own job or own your own property, like our own house, or you can have your own career, such as an entrepreneur. You can create your own business. And to me, that's the American dream. But with that comes the idea of nativism. And this is the political position that favors Americans or citizens of a nation in particular over newcomers or immigrants. And this has been a general term for opposition to immigration based on fears that immigrants are going to distort or spoil existing cultural or religious values, gain too much political power, or take jobs. This is something that has existed since the very beginning of our country and still exists to this day. And I want to point out this flag here. And the idea that, remember, I've been talking so much about historical context and understanding the time period in which something is created, because as you look at this word here, Native Americans, you're automatically perhaps conditioned to think of Indian Native Americans, the first peoples who were here before European contact, but that is not who this is referring to. Really, we almost have to add the word born. So native born Americans is who they're referring to in this time period. Beware of foreign influence. So make sure that you're looking at the sourcing of an image to understand what time period it is to better understand something like this. So we have a lot of cartoons that are created during this time, and I'm going to be showing you many more of these as we go through. But as you can see here, this figure, whenever you see it, that's Uncle Sam. And he is guarding the flag, and it says danger to American ideals and institutions. And we have this flood of immigration coming in. And we see on the hats of some of the people that are coming the ideas of pauper, illiterate, outlaw, anarchist, and criminal, and many other words, all describing ideas that are not something that we want to welcome to the United States. And this says the high tide of immigration, a national menace. Immigration statistics for the past year show that the influx of foreigners was the greatest in our history, and also that the hardworking peasants are now being supplanted by criminals and outlaws of all Europe. So there's been this tendency throughout American history to demonize immigrants that are coming in. And even immigrants themselves who have been here for a little bit of time or who are maybe first generation Americans tend to do this for new immigrants that are coming in. So as I said, this is a pattern throughout American history and nothing new at all. It's been going on for a long time. In the 1840s and 1850s, we had an increased rise in nativism, partly because of increased immigration. As I mentioned, this was the German and Irish that were coming. There was a huge outpouring of anti-Catholicism during this time, and a lot of it had to do with fears of job competition. And to give an example of a little story related to the Irish, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, is that during the 1860s, during the Civil War, there is going to be a massive riot called the draft riots. And this is going to pit the Irish against Black Americans. And part of it was a result of this fears of job competition that Irish individuals, they attacked and destroyed uh, area buildings and threatened to. There was a lot of violence against Black people, and this was in northern cities. This wasn't in the South where the primarily the war was being fought. But this has to do with the idea that the Irish immigrants were not happy being drafted to fight a war which would free the former slaves, which would give them job competition. And so it shows you that even the Irish themselves, who are being recipients of this anti-immigration, this fears of job competition, are doing it to them, to others as well. And in the 1850s, we get the creation of the Know Nothing Party, who, as I previously mentioned, support this native-born Americans. And there is a cartoon on the left here that shows the Irish and the Germans as stealing the ballot box. And you can see Irish whiskey and German lager beer. And they often talked about reasons they didn't like the Irish as being because they drank too much. The same thing for the Germans, but they really saw the rising influence of German immigrants as well as Irish immigrants coming into these cities as taking more political power. And that was one of the things that they feared greatly. And so this political party was formed, and it's called the Know Nothing Party because when people asked about what they stood for, they said, "I know nothing." Then when the Chinese arrived, and between 1850 and 1882, the Chinese population in the United States soared to about 300,000 individuals, and they comprised 8.6% of California's total population, but even more so of its wage earners, 25%. And by 1870, 26% of California's Chinese population lived in San Francisco, in one particular city, and made up almost half of the labor force in four key industries: boot and shoemaking, woolen cloth, cigar and tobacco manufacturing, and sewing. And by 1880, you can see the numbers here have increased even more. So you can see that there is going to be competition for jobs potentially. So there's going to be a rise in Chinese immigration, as I mentioned, and the result is racism and discrimination. One of the reasons that they didn't like the Irish, as I said before, is because they saw them as lazy. They saw them as drinking too much. Typically, prior to this point, reasons for discrimination had to do with people not working hard enough, not being less than. The reason that they didn't like the Chinese was because they worked too hard. So there were positive reasons that they didn't like them. And they were making other people look bad because they would show up early, they would work for less wages, they would stay longer. And so a lot of people didn't like that. And one of the areas in which they worked really hard and they were extremely successful was laundromats. And you can see here there's some artifacts from a laundromat in Stockton, California. Well, Irish workers make up a large percentage of laborers in the eastern section of the Transcontinental Railroad, which we're going to talk more about that in one of the videos on the American West. But it's important to understand that you have Irish workers who are working towards the west. They're starting in the east and working west, and you have Chinese workers who are working along the Central Pacific Railroad, and they're going to meet in Promontory Point, Utah. And it's going to lead to a lot of clashes between Chinese workers and white workers that are there. And this is a quote from 1869. We warn working men that a new and dangerous foe looms up in the far west. Already our brothers of the Pacific have to meet it, and just as soon as the Pacific Railroad is completed, these Chinamen will begin to swarm through the Rocky Mountains like devouring locusts and spread out over the countryside. Men who can work for $1 a day are a dangerous element in our country. We must not sleep until the foe is upon us, but commence to fight him now. In the name of the working men of our common country, we demand that our government forbid another Chinaman to set foot on our shores. And so there is a group of individuals who are going to begin to campaign for limiting and outright banning Chinese individuals from coming to this country. And if you look at this quote, you can see why. They're afraid that they are, right now, they're just working on the Pacific Railroad. But when that job is complete, they're going to be looking for other jobs. And they're going to spread out all over the country and basically steal our jobs, is what they're talking about here. And so in California, there are nativists who are going to pressure Congress. And you can see here an image, a cartoon that says the magic washer, again, because they're in laundromats. And there's Uncle Sam. He's kicking out a Chinese person. He says the Chinese must go. And then we have some other cartoons with the Chinese. And this one is by Thomas Nast, who we've talked about previously, I believe, but we will talk about a lot during this unit. And it says at the bottom, every dog has his day, no distinction of color has his day. And you can see here that the Native American is talking to the Chinaman about, hey, it was me first, and now it's your turn. And you can see the Chinese must go, the Chinese problem, and all of these different things that are written over there. And on the right-hand side, you see this image where the Chinese individual has a character is larger than life. He looks non-human, and that was a characteristic that they did a lot, especially with the Irish. You'll see coming up in a minute. But you can see the word monopoly over his hand, and then all the stuff underneath has to do with the laundromat. So they're accusing them of having a monopoly, and we'll learn that term a little bit later. But I'll give you a preview that it's basically when one group of people or one individual or one business has total control or almost total control over an industry. So what they're trying to say here is that the Chinese have way too much power when it comes to the laundromats, and nobody else can possibly work in them because they have a monopoly. They have total control over the laundry industry. So in 1882, Congress will pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which will make it unlawful for Chinese laborers to enter the country. And so it basically shuts the door for Chinese workers to come, but it goes a step further and says that those Chinese who already live in the United States are now ineligible to become U.S. citizens. And this was initially set for 10 years, was renewed in 1892 for 10 more years, was made permanent in 1902, and you can see remained in effect until during World War II. So it's a very long time period that the Chinese were excluded from this country. We're going to step outside the time period for a second here, because during this time period, there's a lot of, even though the Gilded Age ends in 1898, we're going to dip into period 7 a little bit with the Progressive Era, because the story needs to be told together. And so Japanese workers were also ones that were not allowed in, but it was not a law. It was simply a handshake that made this agreement. And so to give you a little bit of backstory, if you look at the right-hand image that talks about no Japs in our schools, citizens meeting, in the city of San Francisco in particular, Japanese children were segregated from other school children. And Japanese immigrants had also, once the Chinese were excluded, Japanese immigrants came in and were working in California, and they were very strong in agriculture, many successful farmers. And so people began to say that once again, you're too successful, you're ruining, our opportunities, we need you gone. And so, because of the segregation that was happening, the government of Japan made a deal with California, um, that basically, if you desegregate your schools and you allow our children to go to school with other children, then we will agree not to send any workers to the United States. And that's what the gentleman's agreement was with Japan, is that they stopped allowing people to emigrate to the United States, in exchange for this. And then also in California, they went a step further in 1913 with the Alien Land Law, Alien Land Act, which says that anyone who is Asian in California was not allowed to own agricultural land. So basically, they're trying to cut off their profits by making them have to work for someone else, and instead of allowing them to own land and be profitable and be successful. And so this is an important part of the story that is going to build towards period 7 when we talk about ultimately World War II and Japanese internment that will come up. The thing to understand is, so all of these new people came, and it's going to bring new problems with it. We're going to have greed and corruption, or urbanization, overcrowding, and industrial accidents that will lead to political, social, and economic problems. And during our live session is where I'm going to go over some more of the Irish, particularly, and show you a couple of images related to the Irish and how they were portrayed as less than human as well. And the Gilded Age, really, we are going to break down. We're going to talk about social actually first, and talk about urbanization and overcrowding and some of the ways that people dealt with those problems and tried to solve them and fix them, because we have this group of individuals that will come up that will be reformers. Just like in period 4 during the antebellum period, where people saw that there was a need to fix society, we're going to have that same thing here. And so the Gilded Age part is the problems, and the progressive era is the solutions. And so we're going to put those two together. As far as economic, we're going to talk about the corruption and the greed that's going to happen as these people grow their industries and ways to stop those, but also the working conditions and how poorly it was for workers, and including industrial accidents, and see how people tried to solve that. And then finally, also corruption and greed in politics and how those were tried to be dealt with. And that is the overview and introduction to the Gilded Age, as well as immigration during the time period.